Before kings built kingdoms, they built cages and called them homes for women. Beneath the first Mesopotamian sun, power was not measured in wisdom or courage, but in ownership, land, livestock, and the women who carried his heirs. They carved laws into stone to make that ownership eternal. The Code of Hammurabi did not merely list punishments. It cataloged a hierarchy of human value. A wife could be drowned for another man's desire, while her husband walked free. A daughter was a currency for sealing debts. They called it justice. It was ownership dressed as order. But before the law, there was the temple. In the shrines of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, women once stood as her living voices. Priestesses sang to the sky, their bodies seen as vessels of the divine. But the men who praised the goddess began to fear the women who served her. Slowly, the priestess bowed to the priest. The goddess became an excuse for control, and worship turned to rule. That is how power begins, not with a shout, but with a slow, silent shift. When reverence turns into command, and devotion becomes domination, imagine the weight of that silence. The first woman told her body was not her own, but a boundary marker for a man's field. The first girl given away like a prize animal to seal a treaty she would never understand. This was not the beginning of civilization, but the beginning of control. In the markets of Sumer, marriage was not romance, but transaction. A woman's body was the seal on contracts, the bridge between families, the preserver of bloodlines. The very word for wife shared its root with possession. Her silence was called virtue, her obedience, survival. Centuries later, Simone de Beauvoir would give words to this ancient truth. Man defines woman not in herself, but in relation to him. In Mesopotamia, that definition was carved in stone. A woman could be sacred or condemned, but never simply human. As empires rose and fell, the blueprint was copied and refined. Centuries later, Greece would call itself the cradle of freedom, the birthplace of democracy and reason. But for women, it was a polished cage. In Athens, men debated liberty in the open air, while their wives and daughters lived in the shadows. The philosophers, fathers of logic, declared woman a defective man, made for obedience. Even their myths whispered the same judgment again and again. Pandora, whose curiosity unleashed every sorrow upon the world. Helen, whose beauty burned cities. When men feared chaos, they gave it a woman's face, and in their art, they perfected the contradiction. In marble and paint, her body was flawless, her mouth forever closed. Art replaced her truth. Silence was sculpted into elegance. Behind those marble walls, life was a study in confinement. Girls, barely teenagers, were sold as brides to men they'd never met. They could be discarded if barren, ignored if wise, punished if seen. They lived as symbols, not selves. Mary Wollstonecraft would later write, "Taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming round its gilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison." She could have been writing about Athens. Then came Rome. Empire of masks and marble, of public virtue and private vice. It conquered nations, and with the same relentless efficiency, it conquered its women. Roman law was a masterpiece of contradiction. Public morality demanded purity. Private pleasure demanded compliance. The paterfamilias, the father, held the power of life and death over his entire household. Lucretia's name survives not for who she was, but for what was done to her. Her suffering became the symbol of civic virtue, the spark for a revolution. A woman's pain became the stage for a man's honor. And Cleopatra, philosopher queen, ruler, strategist.
Rome remembered her not for her mind or empire, but for her beauty. When they could not match her power, they made her sexuality the crime. Rome worshipped its goddesses, Venus, Juno, but the living women beneath their statues lived under guardianship. They could inherit little, speak less, and own almost nothing. The empire called it morality. It was, as always, fear disguised as order. With the rise of new faiths, the language of control changed once more. It was no longer just law or philosophy, it was divine will. The medieval world offered women two paths, the sanctified mother or the dangerous sinner. The church fathers debated whether women even possessed souls. They lifted up the virgin, pure, silent, maternal, while Eve's legacy condemned every daughter. The witch emerged, the healer, the midwife, the solitary woman, and for her independence, she was burned.
For 1,000 years, the message was carved into stone and preached from pulpits. A woman's body was corruption, and her salvation lay in its denial. Then a flicker of light. The Age of Enlightenment promised reason, rights, liberty for all, but the question echoed, for whom? Rousseau praised freedom, but declared that a woman's purpose was to please. Revolutions cried, liberty, equality, fraternity, and left women outside the circle. Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. For her audacity, she was silenced by the guillotine. Every time man expanded the circle of rights, he drew a new line to keep woman outside it. For millennia, men told themselves they were protecting women, from chaos, from temptation, from themselves. Protection became confinement. Desire became domination. When power rests on control, love becomes performance. Women learned to survive by pleasing, to stay safe by surrendering. That is how oppression hides, not in cruelty, but in habits of obedience that feel like virtue. Virginia Woolf said every woman needs a room of her own. But in these worlds, there were no rooms, only spaces men allowed. Empires rose and fell, yet the blueprint remained. From slave to wife, from concubine to muse, from sinner to saint, the idea stayed the same. A woman exists to serve a man's story. You can trace it in law and legend, in scripture and song. Each time a civilization praised the feminine ideal, it quietly chained the living woman behind it. History was written by those allowed to speak. For millennia, women's tongues were cut from the record. Male poets filled the silence and called it virtue. But every empire forgets one truth. Silence stores energy. The words women could not say became the stories they would one day tell. The prayers whispered in the dark became the protests shouted in the light. From Sappho's fragments to Christine de Pizan's defiant ink, from Wollstonecraft's vindication to Sojourner Truth's question, ain't I a woman? From the suffragettes' silent marches to Simone de Beauvoir's second sex, the pattern began to crack. The goddess returns, not as myth to be worshipped, but as memory reclaimed. She speaks through historians, unearthing the tablets once read only by men. She lives in the artists who shape her not as perfection, but as person. The empires built on her body have turned to dust, but the echoes remain, in the expectations whispered to daughters, and in the stories still told about what a woman should be. But history has a new storyteller now. She does not ask permission. She does not whisper. Her voice crosses time, from the deserts of Mesopotamia, through the courtyards of Athens, across the marble halls of Rome, out of the silence of medieval convents, and the salons of the Enlightenment. It carries one unshakable truth. You built your civilizations on my silence. Now I speak.